Okay, before we get started, I would just like to acknowledge that I know I could be addressing a rather touchy subject here, so I would just like to take a moment to note that I'll be trying to look at this as objectively, impartially, and fairly as possible. And no supplemental material will be taken into account here, only what's shown in the movie. Also, I know I said I wasn't going to make too many videos of this nature, but I just felt this was something worth covering. And finally, as should be obvious, there will be major spoilers ahead for this movie. So it's a really good time to click off the video if you haven't seen it yet. This will be your only warning. Alright, so to get right into it, unlike what the title implies, I am not trying to blame Imelda for Hector's death or what Ernesto de la Cruz did to him or his songs afterwards. The question I am trying to answer, however, is if she's partially to blame for Ernesto getting away with everything for so long and Hector almost dying the final death. Now, once again, I'm going to be completely fair and objective when answering this. So I guess the best place to start is to go over everything that's presented to us. Now, not all that much is really explained within the movie, which can lead to a lot of speculation. Now again, I know there is supplemental material that covers some of this, but I feel that the movie should be able to stand on its own, and thus we will only be considering what is shown, stated, or implied to have happened in the actual movie. So keeping that in mind, we do know that Hector was a very dedicated family man and loved them more than anything, and that Imelda was a happier woman when married to him than we see her in the present. But then Hector goes out hoping to share his music with the world and maybe even better his family's situation in the process. He sends notes back for several months before suddenly it just stops and they never hear from him again. And her response to this, and granted, we don't know how long she waited to take these measures, was to ban any mention of him in any form of music as well, blaming that for his leaving. And the obvious question to ask here is, was she really justified in reacting that way? And honestly, I think the short answer is no. But the thing is, the narrative correctly shows that her ban on music was wrong, but doesn't call her out nearly as much over her treatment of Hector. I mean, you could argue that she was just so broken up over his seemingly abandoning them that her only way of coping with it was to destroy any memory of him. But here's the thing. Does Hector really seem like the kind of guy that would just up and abandon his family? Again, we don't get to see much, but based off the little bits we do see, does he really seem like the type of man that would put music, or anything else for that matter, over his family? And you'd think that if anybody would know that he wouldn't, it would be the woman who married him. And yet, when he disappears, her first thought is to just assume that he ditched them to play music. And how can we say for certain that this was her first assumption? Because if she had bothered to make even the smallest inquiries into his whereabouts, it probably would have come back to her that he had died, and thus she would have known he hadn't abandoned them, at least voluntarily. Now, it isn't impossible that Ernesto could have hidden Hector's death, but considering he seems like the type to take no chances, at least when he thinks there are no chances anyway, it's most probable that he simply told the authorities that Hector died of food poisoning and was buried in a nearby cemetery, as most were back in 1921, unless special arrangements were made to ship them back home. So while we can't say it for 100% certain, it's most likely that Imelda would have been informed of Hector's death had she made any inquiries or made an attempt to find him. So, with it being most likely that she just assumed he had up and left, it tends to imply she didn't have much faith in him or wasn't a very trusting person to begin with. I mean, it never crossed her mind that something bad might have happened to him, and that's why he didn't come back? What if he'd been in a bad accident that kept him in some no-name town for a few years with no way to contact his family, and suddenly came back? And that's not even considering that she was completely oblivious to the fact that Ernesto de la Cruz became famous singing the songs her husband wrote and would undoubtedly sometimes sing together, all because she put a ban on music based on her assumption that that's what caused Hector to leave her. And we know that has to be the case, because had she realized at any point that Ernesto was using Hector's songs, that probably would have clued her into the fact that something was wrong. And considering she still has no doubt about her husband by the events of the movie, we know that can't have happened even in the afterlife. And what makes this even worse, and something that's directly stated, is that she never gives him a chance to explain himself. I mean, even if she still wholeheartedly believed he abandoned them completely of his own free will, how did the fact that he doesn't look a day over 25 not raise a red flag or hint that something larger might have been at work? Because going by appearance alone, it's obvious he died a young man. But even then, she still never even gives him a chance. Now, I can see how a lifetime of resentment could cause a person to not want to listen to what she probably believes to be a baloney excuse and false apology. But especially given his age, you'd think most people would at least give the other person a chance to explain themselves before turning them away, if simply to know why they did it. Because when you really look at it, who's the one that really abandoned the other here? Hector was banished from his own family and nearly forgotten before he gets a chance to explain himself, all because he had the misfortune to be murdered, and his wife going on to assume that he just left, even though that flies right in the face of everything she knows about him. However, once everything is explained to her and she still defends her actions by saying, "So what if it's true? You still left me alone to raise a daughter." I can completely see where she's coming from and don't blame her at all for that. Because after spending almost a century hating somebody and believing they abandoned you, all of that resentment isn't going to just disappear the moment you're told you're wrong. And as shown, the longer she has to process it, the more she starts to forgive him. But the thing is she really the one that should be forgiving him? Because when you really look at it, she abandoned and almost basically killed him on a total assumption. And I'm not saying she was wrong to be angry with him, but it's the fact that she was so quick to assume the worst in him that's the problem. And that also extends to her behavior regarding everyone else as well. I mean, she rules her family with an iron fist to the point that they won't even help their descendant stay alive if it's against what she wants. Seriously, either you go home my way or no way. You're basically telling your grandson that either he conforms to your demands or he dies. I mean, even if she didn't intend on following through on that threat, isn't that taking things way too far? And her response when Miguel defies her is to continue insisting that he see things her way instead of just getting the boy home before he ends up dead. And whenever anything doesn't go her way, her first instinct is to start yelling. Now, the thing is, I get it. This movie is accurately reflecting that in Mexican culture, Family is very important, and their opinions are held in only the highest regards. But when it gets to a point like Imelda had it, one might even be justified in saying that she's totally abusing that. But the problem here isn't necessarily that she did all of this, but that the narrative never calls her out on it, nor does she ever own up to her behavior on screen. Because the one time she's going to, Hector stops her and says, "This is my fault, not yours." And while I can see why he would say that, after probably beating himself up for almost a century for leaving in the first place, in truth, it is way more her fault than his. Because his biggest sin was trusting the wrong person, while Imelda went on to just assume he left her, basically ensured he would be forgotten, and went on to rule her family with such an unhealthy grip that it caused problems in both her living and dead family. And I'd say the responsibility for that lies much more with her than it does with him, because she didn't have to react like that. So really, if anybody should be apologizing or should be asking for forgiveness, it should be her, not him. Now, to be fair, I have no doubt that there was quite a bit of apologizing during the 1 year skip on all sides, but I really do think the writers should have put in a scene somewhere where she either admits that she took things too far, or where somebody calls her out on the fact that she took things too far, and that her grip on the family is an extremely unhealthy one. Because when you really look at her actions, she can easily almost come across as looking unsympathetic. Now, please do note that I'm saying almost, because I do understand that Hector's leaving obviously took a heavy toll on her, and once she knows the truth, does start to own up to her behavior, even if she doesn't say so in words. Plus, there's also the fact that no matter which way you look at it, most of the blame still lies with Ernesto de la Cruz regardless. And there's also the fact that if she doesn't react throughout the movie the way she does, then obviously there wouldn't have been a movie to begin with. But at the same time, I still think the writers should have dedicated a bit more to putting her in a slightly more sympathetic light. Because as I've said before, with the way she's written in the movie, she arguably comes rather close to crossing a line that only the villain is really supposed to cross. Well, that's about everything I've got on that. So now I wanted to hear your thoughts. Do you believe that Imelda almost comes across as unsympathetic because of her actions, or do you believe she was written perfectly? Please feel free to let me know in the comments. And as always, you don't have to agree with me on the conclusion I've just reached. I only want to have a conversation with you, nothing more. Thank you all for watching. I really appreciate all the support, and I hope to see you all next time.